I'm going to build a router table cabinet. Coming up. What's up, everybody? My name is Tim, and welcome to another episode of The Average Craftsman. If you enjoy watching adequately produced videos of woodworking and other DIY projects, please subscribe. In today's episode, we're going to be building this router table cabinet. It has drawers and trays for storing all of your router bits and accessories, and it's also mobile, so you can get out of the way when you're not using it. Let's get started. My first step was using my track saw to break down a couple sheets of 3/4 inch plywood into more manageable pieces. When I use my track saw for this purpose, I always leave pieces oversized 1/4 to 1/2 inch so I can square everything up at the table saw. I don't count on the plywood being perfectly square, and I find it difficult and too time consuming to try to get everything exactly right with a track saw. The way I designed this cabinet requires 2 sheets of 3/4 inch and 1 sheet of 1/2 inch plywood. If you change the drawer bottoms and back to 3/4, then you could get away with just 2 sheets. I used Pure Bond plywood from Home Depot. It's pretty much my go-to for birch plywood. It's a lot better quality than most of what you find in the big box stores, yet it's significantly cheaper than Baltic birch, at least in Kansas City. Once I had everything cut to width, I used my miter sled to square up the ends and cut everything to length. I used pocket holes for all the joinery on this cabinet, so it was time to start drilling. Pocket holes are quick and easy and plenty strong for this cabinet. I drilled holes for all the carcass parts and then started assembly. I attached the sides to the bottom and then to the top stretchers. Before going any further with the carcass, I needed to install the drawer slides for the 2 storage trays, as I wouldn't have the room once the upper vertical dividers were in place. I used my Craig drawer slide jig to align the slides. I've used this jig a few times now, and I like it, but just not sure it's worth it. Using scraps for spacers is every bit as easy and accurate in my opinion. Also, depending on the placement of the slides, you might not even be able to use this jig. I marked the location of the slides on the cabinet sides, attached the jig, and then placed the slides. I used a self-centering bit to pre-drill the mounting holes and then secured the slides with the screws provided. Speaking of these slides, I found what I believe is a great deal on Amazon. These are 22-inch full extension slides with a 100-pound capacity, and I was able to get 10 pairs for about $70. I'll have a link in the description if you're interested. I turned my attention to the interior cabinet parts. There is a horizontal divider, 2 upper vertical dividers, and 1 lower vertical divider. The upper dividers needed to be notched out around the stretchers, so I put them in place and marked out where I needed to cut, and then took them over to the bandsaw. If you don't have a bandsaw, a jigsaw works perfectly fine for these cuts. I sanded the dividers in the bottom before attaching them to the carcass. It's just easier at this point rather than after they are installed. I don't like sanding or finishing, so I take the opportunity anytime I can to make these steps easier on myself. I used the vertical dividers to position the horizontal divider and then secured it with pocket screws. I then cut some spacers and clamped the vertical dividers in place. I attached the bottom of the dividers to the horizontal divider with pocket screws and then pre-drilled and attached the tops to the cabinet stretchers with 1 1/4 inch screws. I used a similar process to attach the lower divider off camera, and the carcass was complete. Moving on to the drawers and pull-out trays, I installed the rest of the slides and measured the opening of the bottom drawers. Back at the table saw, I ripped down all of the drawer and tray parts to size and cut the drawer sides to length specified in the cut list with the miter sled. For the drawer fronts and backs, I took a cue from Brad Rodriguez over at Fix This Build That, and I measured the drawer openings. Let's say that measurement was 15 inches. I then set my stop block on my miter sled to 15 inches and put 2 cutoffs of the same plywood against the stop block and slid the fronts and backs up against those 2 cutoffs. This gives you perfectly sized drawers with a lot less math. I pretty much used all of Brad's techniques on drawer construction. There are links in the description of some of his videos if you want to check those out. With all of the drawer and tray parts cut, I pulled out the pocket hole jig again and drilled holes in all of those parts. For the router bit storage trays, I'm using Rockler's router bit storage inserts. All you have to do is drill a 5/8 inch hole and then push the inserts into the holes. The inserts hold either 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch shank bits. If you don't want to buy those inserts, then you'll just need to drill out 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch holes depending on the size of your router bits. Be careful about drilling all the way through though. If you do, you'll need to line the bottom of the trays with something to keep some of the smaller bits from falling through. You could also just set a depth stop when drilling. I started to mark out where I wanted the inserts on the tray and ran into my first mistake of this project. I should have drilled out these holes before drilling the pocket holes, which ended up being in the way quite a bit. It would have been a lot easier to lay out all the inserts and then drill the pocket holes. Once I got the layout done, I took the trays to the drill press and used a 5/8 inch Forstner bit to drill out all of the holes. One of my next investments needs to be a decent set of Forstner bits. This one was about as sharp as a spoon and I had a ton of tear out. It was now time to start assembling the drawers and trays. I have a devil of a time keeping things square when I use pocket holes, so I started making a squaring jig on my assembly table to help keep everything in line. I should probably just buy a few of those squaring clamps, but I only remember I need them once I'm at this point. I ended up using a combination of clamps and the squaring jig to make the drawers as square as possible. I returned to the table saw to cut out the drawer bottoms. I used 1/2 inch for the bottoms in the back of the cabinet. Most people use 1/4 inch, but it's not that much more money to use half. They're beefier, and I have a lot more use for 1/2 inch scraps than 1/4 inch scraps. I ripped the bottoms to width and then used the miter sled to square one end and then cut them to length. Mistake number 2.
Bullshit.
I cut the bottoms too short. Not sure where I made the error, but whatever. They were close enough and it's just shop furniture. To attach the bottoms, I drilled and countersunk 4 1/4 inch screws. When installing the bottom drawers and the slide out trays, I used paint stirrers as spacers on the bottom. I slid the drawer into place, pulled out the extensions, and lined them up with the front of the drawer. Use a self-centering bit to drill pilot holes and then attach the first 2 holes of the extensions to the drawer with the screws provided. I then removed the drawer from the slides and attached the rear parts of the extensions to the drawer sides. Rinse and repeat for all the other drawers and trays. The cabinet has a 1/2 inch back on it that is recessed into the cabinet carcass with a hole cut out for dust collection. I made a 3/8 inch rabbet using my router and this really cool multi-bit I found from Whiteside. It's basically 8 bits in one. You just change out the bearing depending on how big of a rabbet you need. The largest bearing is used for using it as a flush trim bit. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in learning more. Once the rabbet was made, I cut the back to size over at the table saw and then rounded the corners with my jigsaw. To make the opening for the dust collection port, I drilled a hole in each corner and then connected them with my jigsaw. I used some weather stripping around the dust port, pre-drilled some holes, and then sanded the back. Half-inch screws were used to attach the dust port to the back, which was then attached to the cabinet with brad nails. The only thing left on the cabinet is to put the false fronts on the drawers and trays and add the door to the router compartment. I wanted a continuous grain look, so they were cut from a single piece of plywood. Once everything was cut, I used the Kreg cabinet hardware jig to drill all of the holes for the drawer and door pulls. I finished up the fronts and door with a quick sanding. I clamped a straight edge on the bottom of the cabinet to line up the bottom of the drawer fronts. Once the fronts were positioned where I wanted them, they were screwed to the drawer through the holes that were drilled for the pulls. This was a trick I learned from the Wood Whisperer. It's a clamp-free way of accurately positioning the drawer fronts. Just pull out the drawer and you can permanently fasten the fronts on from the inside. Remove the temporary screws and attach the pulls. I mounted the hinges on the cabinet and then transferred their center lines to the door. Half overlay European hinges were used on the door, and again I reached for a Kreg jig. This time it was a door hinge jig, and this, along with the cabinet hardware jig, is well worth the money in my opinion. All you have to do is position the jig and use the included Forstner bit to drill the hinge cup, and then use the provided drill guides for the pilot holes to attach the hinge to the door. The hinges were then attached to the door and cabinet with a few screws. After a couple of adjustments and adding the pole, the doors and drawers were done. I want this cabinet to be mobile, so I attached some 4-inch locking casters. After a quick sanding of the sides, it was time to attach the router table top. I used a Rockler top for my table and installed it by pre-drilling and then driving screws through the cabinet stretchers into the top. This was mistake number 3. I didn't have the pull-out trays in when I positioned the top, so the fronts were protruding beyond the corner of the top, and it looked pretty terrible. I removed the screws, repositioned it on the cabinet, and it looks much better now. Now on to dust collection. I threw this together pretty quickly, and we'll have to see how it works with some use. It has over and under the table collection and uses the Rockler Dust Right adapters to connect to my dust collector. When it's all hooked up, it's quite obtrusive, but I don't use the router table a ton, so it shouldn't be much of a problem. It also quickly disconnects and stores in the router compartment, so when the table is not in use, it's not in the way and it's not sticking out this far. Alright, time to fill this thing up. As I said earlier, I bought Rockler router bit storage inserts and they work great. I have almost 60 inserts on the 2 shelves and could easily add more down the road if needed. The rest of the storage I used for anything router related. I did not fill up the right side pullout tray as I'm planning on getting a new router and router lift soon, and those will have the accessories that I want to store on that side of the cabinet. And that is a wrap for this project. A couple things to note. One, I did not put a finish on this project. I probably will later at some point, and it'll probably just be water-based polyurethane or something like that. B, I did not drill a hole for the power cord. That is because this is not the router that is going to be permanent in this router table. At some point, I'm going to get a new router that has one of those paddle switches with a speed control on it. And I'm just not sure how or where I'm going to mount that. So once I get it, I'll be able to figure all that out. If you are interested in building this router table cabinet, I do have plans available that include a cut list, step-by-step instructions, as well as both Fusion 360, and SketchUp models. You can find a link to those plans along with all of the tools and materials I used on this project in the description down below. The plans will be 50% off the first week after this video is published, so if you're thinking about buying them, now's the time. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, I'd love it if you would subscribe. All right, until next time, good day.